Hello, everybody. My name is Barry Johnson, and welcome back to another edition of Studio Talk. Today, the question is Outboard hardware for tracking, for mixing, or for both? Let's get to it. Okay, all right. So incorporating outboard gear has really kind of, for the home project studio, has blown up over the last 6 or so years, 6 to 8 years. I mean, it's obviously always existed, but it's really kind of blown up. So what caused it to blow up? Well, you had a lot of manufacturers out there making some clones of some very popular, iconic studio gear, and making them in a price point that most of us mortal human beings can afford. Okay, so you started seeing a lot of that. And then API came out with the 500 series. It's a little bit slow to take off, right? Initially, a lot of you may not realize this, but a lot of people were hesitant about 500 series because if I'm going to invest in hardware in my home recording studio, man, I want it to look cool. I want to look over there like I'm looking right now, and I'm seeing lots of racks of 19-inch gear. Man, it makes me look like I got a professional recording studio. And saying, but when you put them all in that little 500 rocks, which I've got one right there, and I got one back over there. They don't look as stunning. They're not like, oh my gosh, not unless you got a gazillion of them, okay? But if you got 6 of them in a box, it doesn't have the visual stimulating appeal that it does, okay? And then we finally realized that, okay, that's just all showmanship. That's just a bunch of fancy, nice stuff. What's practical for us? And one of the great things about the 500 series is you can get that close to your mix position, right? Your sweet spot. So you're not having to move as far to adjust a lot of different parameters. So anyway, the 500 series was slow to take off, but I would say it has boomed now. It has become huge. I'm a huge fan of the 500 series. And so, and I'm an advocate and an owner and an appreciator of outboard hardware gear. Okay. I definitely believe that it has its place, if you can afford it in the project studio. As good as plugins have gotten, they are still not as good as hardware. And I don't know, quite frankly, if we'll ever quite get there. Some get really close depending on the hardware, but there's always something that's very noticeable in it. Does that mean that you have to go down that road? No. Does that mean that you can't make killer music with just nothing but plugins? Of course not. Of course not. And honestly, are those little small things that guys like me and other people are hearing in the hardware that we hear is advantageous? Is that really moving the needle that much when you start intermixing those with all the various other tracks in there? Is that all getting lost in the mix, or is being diminished, the impact of that being diminished in the mix? There's some truth to that. Okay. But there's a reason that all these high-end studios still have outboard gear, and it's not because, well, they already own it. Some of that may be the case. Now, here's a big misconception I think a lot of people have out there. And what I'm about ready to say doesn't apply to every studio, but it's pretty widespread. Today, this hasn't always been the case, but today, when you see a lot of these studios that have all these walls of racks of gear, it may surprise you, but very few of them are using any of that hardware for mixing. Did we just hear a pin drop? I think we did. Very little of that hardware most likely is used for mixing. Maybe the console if it's on a Neve or an SSL, maybe those inboard EQs and things. But for the most part, that outboard today is used for tracking. Now, I've got a couple videos out there. I talk about the importance, I think, where most home project studios really miss the mark in creating great music is they do not put their energy on mastering the art of tracking analog sources. They don't put anywhere near the amount of emphasis on that they do on learning how to mix. Okay. And so that's why they don't get the mixes sometimes they want, because they're polishing a turd. Okay. They didn't do a great job of tracking it to begin with. And so most of that today in a lot of these studios is used for the tracking purposes, because most of the time the odds are wherever that song was tracked, the odds are it is not going to get mixed in that same space. It's not going to happen. Okay, so most of these studios today are tracking studios, or they're either being used for tracking and or mixing, but But rarely is it, you're coming in and tracking and mixing in the same location today. Now, your local studio market will be that way. I'm talking about the major big boys, okay? Which there's very few of them left, but the ones out there are like that. And so, so when I say dot during mixing, I mean it's like hardware inserts. I'm talking about inserts on channels. Today, if I'm the practicality of incorporating hardware for mixing is it's a workflow issue. And so what is that workflow issue? Well, if you're everything has to be done in real time if you want to use a piece of hardware on multiple tracks. So yeah, if you're sitting in your studio and you're doing a 24 track band or whatever, and you own 12 compressors and 12 different outboard EQs. And, maybe you can incorporate that into that situation, but you're still only going to get half of it. Okay. So if you want to use that gear, you have to go out of your hardware insert, out of your DAW. Okay. So I've got track one. Let's say track one's a bass and I want to run it through a compressor and an EQ. Excuse me. So now I've got that bass track coming out of my hardware interface. I'm sorry, I need to take a drink of something. My hardware interface. You get why this is called studio talk, right? We're talking about things. Out of a hardware insert, out of my interface, going to the input of my analog piece of hardware gear. So say I'm going to go into an 1176 compressor. So I'm going out of the hardware insert, out of my interface, out of the output of that particular channel. Let's say it's channel 5, okay? So out of an insert of channel 5 on my interface, and I go into the input of the compressor. I go out of the compressor into the input of an EQ. I go out of the EQ back into channel 5 of my interface because most DAWs require, if you're using hardware insert, to go in and out of the same channel. Not all, but certainly Pro Tools does. Okay. So now I've got that back in. So what's happening is it's going out of my computer, out to that analog hardware, being converted from digital to analog, going through the analog hardware, coming back in analog, being converted again, analog back to digital. So now I can hear it and listen to it and mix it in my DAW. Okay. So you're basically doing that in the same place that you do a plugin, right? But you're just turning knobs. So if you want to be able to record in other words, if you want to do that with all of your tracks, you have to own all the analog hardware and insert that on every one of those tracks. That's not practical for the vast majority of you out there. So which means you're going to own a limited quantity of hardware pieces. So ultimately what that's going to mean is if you want to have that effect impact that individual track, then now you're going to have to bounce that track down in real time. You can't do it in non-real time like you can in plugins because that's all of that was created and done in the digital domain. What you're doing is affecting it in the analog domain. So what you've got to do is you've got a 4-minute song. You've got to play that song beginning to end, run it through that outboard hardware, and then rinse and repeat for every single track you want to do that with. That is why that's not practical for most people. So let's stay in the mixing side of stages for now. Now, where a lot of people do, and I encourage this, and I think this is an excellent use of outboard hardware if you have the right pieces, is that your mix bus is analog. So you're constantly mixing and everything. And so, you're going out to outboard mix bus compressor, maybe a mix bus EQ, whether it's a Pultec or whatever, or a stereo, 2 Pultecs or stereo, of course. Whether you're doing that, and then now everything you're mixing is going through analog. Now that doesn't impact things as you're tracking because once you finally mix things down, you're mixing it all together. So it's going to go through analog. So you're not having to worry about that bouncing aspect in that situation. So that's where outboard hardware makes sense to put it in that situation. So I encourage you to look into that. There's some great options out there for that. Now back to the tracking aspect of it. So you understand why it's not necessarily practical to think about mixing with analog hardware because you're just, you could have it on a few tracks. And if you would pick your most important tracks, right? So if I was incorporating analog hardware into my mix, the two sources I'm going to put that on first is one, your main vocal and your snare drum. Those are the two I'm going to pick. I'm going to make sure I've got those covered first. If I only have one, it's going to be on the main vocal. That's where I'm going to use it. But that obviously depends on the song and a lot of other factors, but I'm being very generic in that when I say that. So that hardware is not going to be that beneficial to you during the mixing stage for most of you, unless you own a ton of it, and that's not going to be applicable to most of you watching this video today. Some of you will comment, "Well, I only mix analog gear." Yeah, well, you got a boatload of it. You're an exception to the rule, and congratulations, and I'm jealous. So so that means when deciding on outboard hardware to buy and your strategy, you know, shouldn't it be around the tracking aspect of things? Now, here's where you've got to watch. There's a school of thought out there, and this is where some of these discussions can go down a very, very large rabbit hole. Is you've got this whole notion of why track with analog hardware, when you can just, it's easier if you want to compress on the way in. Aren't you kind of risking by overdoing that or doing something you can't fix? Doesn't it make more sense to put that compressor on post tracking? The answer to that is yes. And the answer to that is no. It depends. Okay. If you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to properly track and you don't have a good idea of what end result you're looking for post tracking, in other words, I've talked about this in many videos, but very few of you put the emphasis on tracking that you should and learning that skill set. What you should be doing is try to get that sound as close to your mix sound on the way in as you can. So you're having to do very little, if anything, to it processing wise post the mix. If anything, you're doing creative things with it, not trying to fix or correct things. Okay. So most of you have to be cautious unless you develop that skill set. Now, if you've got that skill set down, you can make these decisions, because let's face it to you, that's how overwhelming the modern day history, and let's start from the 50s going through to today of modern pop music. Okay, that's the way overwhelming the vast majority of it was recorded. They had to think these things throughout in the tracking stages, because they didn't have the flexibility and the tools that we have in the mixing stages. Okay, so if you're having to do a lot of work to fix it in the mix, it's because you're not tracked properly. So that being said, if you are going to do that, what I recommend that you do is you start out gently. Okay. If you're going to do compression, don't do the compression that you're going to do for that final mix. Do it enough just to soften those transients on the way in. Okay. What you want to try and look for is, I'm trying to capture an even keeled waveform but I'm still have dynamics going in it. You're not squashing it. You're just giving it ever so slightly. And in a vocal, that can make a difference during tracking for the vocalist too, to give them something more to work with, more creative flexibility once they know that that compressor is actually helping them out. And so same thing with EQ. Your EQ should really be done first and foremost by picking the right microphone and pairing it with the first mic preamp. That is your first opportunity EQ, even though you're not turning any EQ dials or frequency dials. That's how you're adjusting your frequencies first and foremost. Again, that's why many of you don't think about that. And when you're tracking, so you get that right. And then after that, obviously some high pass, and depending on the instrument, maybe you want to carve out a certain frequency. You're going to need room for them in the mix anyway. So you do that on the tracking, but you do it slightly. You're doing small things on the way in, so you can take creative liberties on the way during the mixing process. So oftentimes, so Barry, if I'm most likely not going to be able to own enough hardware to truly mix my whole session in it, with the exception of my mix bus or particular auxes, like a drum bus or anything else like that, if I'm not going to be able to do that, if that's not realistically for me, and you're suggesting that taking a light touch on tracking on the way in, at least initially, until you get things sorted out and you figured out what you're doing. What you don't want to be doing is having to fix where you overdid it in the tracking with EQ compression or things like that. Okay, so now that I've got that, now I know I need to do that. Then what should my strategy be for purchasing outboard hardware? Now, that's a great question. If you look at many, let's call it mid-tier, semi-professional, maybe not the high-end stuff. If you look at their 500 series racks, you oftentimes see things in pairs. Okay, in other words, two of the same mic preamp, two of the same EQ, two of the same compressor. Let's face it, those three types of outboard hardware are your dominant pieces of types of processing that happen in what we do. It's going to be those three things. And they all interact and work differently with each other depending on what's being used. And so I recommend doing it in pairs. So Barry, why do you say pairs? Why are they doing it in pairs? Well, oftentimes you're tracking certain aspects of the process in a stereo configuration. And what you want, you don't want two different mic preamps when you're stereo micing the same source. You don't want that. You want the same mic preamps. You want the same compressors if you use them. You want the same EQ if you're using it in stereo. So what are the stereo applications I'm going to use? Well, you've got overheads. Okay. Some people will do room mics in stereo or just a mono. You've got many certain instruments, acoustic instruments, especially like acoustic guitar. Oftentimes you record that in stereo. So there's different situations where you're trying to get that stereo effect sound. So you need to use those, and you want them to sound the same in both left and right. So that's why you want to do it in pairs. A lot of people say, well, I want to have a variety of EQs and a variety of compressors. I do too, and I own a variety, but not a tremendous variety. That's probably limited more by budget than anything else, but hey, anyway, whatever. Trust me, I'll take them all. If you've got them you want to send them to me, I'll take everything you've got. Even the cheap stuff, I'll take it all. And so you got to think about that. You try to do it in pairs if you can. If you're just starting out, if I'm just starting out, I mean, I'm brand new to Outboard and I want to go, let's just say I'm going into 500 series. I'm going to start out by I'm going to turn this into 10 different videos. Okay. I'll do another video on this later on, but a Neve mic preamp would be my very first choice, or a clone. All right. A Neve style mic preamp. Okay. I'm going to try to get an 1176 style compressor. Okay. In that vein of compressor. Okay. In a perfect world. And then on top of that, that covers my compressor. I'm going to pick 1176 over an LA2A, although I think you should own both. But I'm going to pick that one as my number 2 for my compressor. And then for my EQ, I'm going to pick a very musical sounding parametric style EQ where I can, do certain things. I'm looking for character. I'm not looking for surgical. I'm looking for character. Lots of great options out there for that. So I've got that. So at least, because the majority of things you're going to be or record initially are going to be on one mic source. Once I've got that, before I'm going on to something else, I'm starting to duplicate that. I'm duplicating that Neve one more time. Okay. Then I'm duplicating that 1176. You can never own enough 1176s. Okay. Then I'm duplicating whatever EQ choice I make. And then beyond that, after that, that's when your flavor and your flexibility should kick in. I think everybody, depending on how much, if you do a lot of analog tracking, I think everybody should own a Neve and a pair of Neve and a pair of API style microphone preamps as an example. You've got, when you get into 1176, again, I'm going off on tangents too much and I've got to be careful with that because it just confuses people. But, you've got 1176, like a Universal Audio 1176 compared to a distressor as an example. A distressor can do the 1176 very, very, very close, but it can do so much more and get into other territory that you cannot do with 1176. And so that's why owning something like that is a flavor, but you definitely want to own that 1176 style compressor. So, so these are the things that, you've kind of you really need to think about, during all of this is where, if I want to get into hardware, what does my strategy need to be? Because I think this video or a video similar, maybe somebody else has got a similar message out there, is something before anybody ever buys a single piece of analog hardware, you should at least watch a video like this, at least to things that you should consider, because most people will just jump in and start buying pieces of hardware that they read about in online forums and other things, without really thinking about what's my strategy for this. Okay. And that's why a lot of people will get into hardware and then get out of hardware, or get into hardware and only have one piece and that's all they ever do. And they think it's a great thing of sliced bread when they would have benefited had they bought something else differently. Nothing against that particular piece of gear that they bought, but they actually could have benefited if they chosen differently. So hopefully this thought process gives you some things to consider, whatever, however it is you get to your decision-making process. I think I'm about to bump my head. You see that reflection? See that shadow right there? You know what that is? That's a shotgun microphone. I literally, here's how I test how I get that shotgun microphone in the right location to try to get as noiseless, noise-free audio as I can for these videos. So I put my finger, like my finger is just touching the bottom of that. So, and I'm looking myself at a monitor over there so I can see. So if the top of my finger is out of frame, then I know that microphone is as close to it as it can. So the distance between my mouth and that shotgun microphone right now is about 10 inches, maybe about 10 inches. Okay. And I spent a tremendous amount of time moving, shaping. I had the microphone under here coming up before. I've had it come from the sides, all the things to try to get the best sound I can. So, like I think about that and why I started thinking about that, I don't know, but I thought that may be a little piece of interesting trivia for you people out there. That's completely unrelated to this particular topic. So, but I think it's an important topic and a little bit long-winded. I know that for sure, but hopefully you find it helpful. So until next time, I hope every one of you have a great day. But before you do that, hit that like, subscribe, and that notification bell, and put some comments down below. Tell me what you think. And then go have yourself a great day, a great hardware day. I'm a big fan of hardware. You should go buy some. Don't get in debt, but go buy some, but be smart about how you do it. Till next time, see you later.